Hello and welcome to Difficult Dialogues today. Thank you everybody for joining us. I'd like to welcome our guest speaker today, Dr. Diane Boyd, who's going to be presenting fences and how do you challenge the traces of colonialism in your setting. So if Diane, would you like to introduce yourself to everybody before we
Hi, I'm Diane. I operate out of Liverpool at the moment, and that I've met Angela through the Sustainability Strategy Group from the Early Childhood Degree Network. And Angela and I have worked on a few things, some articles and possible research, and that's how I came to know Angela. So I shall start. This is more about sort of I've said it will be a narrative that will disrupt, and it's about the fact that it's really important that when you're with students and with early years children, it doesn't really matter in the context of this whether you are the teacher with the early years children or whether it's you that is with the early years student. It's about accepting that there has got to be some disruption and some sort of unsettling, because otherwise, what is the point of education? So these are some little vinaigrettes from discussions that I had with my early childhood studies students. It was very important that it was in a safe environment. When I say safe, it was because of the fact that I'd known them for 3 years. It was a smaller group. It wasn't the whole core module. It was an option module. And therefore, it really sort of highlighted the importance of having a safe environment where people felt that they were able to talk about things that might have been sensitive or caused sensitivity to others. And that also was the same in terms of the enabling environment for early years children, that they need to have that same safe space to speak. I wanted initially with the early childhood students to provoke them to be critical thinkers, because without there being any reflexivity or any sort of form of being critically honest about yourself, then you aren't going to be embedding the same type of honesty and critical reflection into your pedagogy, and therefore make the children who you're going to be supporting and the students to be that. You must give them the freedom to be able to be reflexive. So it was important that it was about honesty and in a safe environment. I wanted them to be able to see all 3 pillars of sustainability, because the majority of time when we talk about sustainability, a lot of the focus is always on environmental and the outside. And I tried to move away from it just being environmental. So at the very beginning of the module, this was a module that was in the level 6 early childhood studies, and it was called Global Dimensions, Sustainable Futures. And they'd had elements of sustainability embedded throughout the whole of the 3 years. But the very first thing I asked them to do in a reflective diary, which they then used throughout the whole of the module and in their assessment and in their presentation, was to keep recording thoughts and provocations. They could draw, they could doodle, they could do whatever they wanted, but they used the journal. And the very first thing I asked them to do in the beginning of this journal was to write what was the purpose of education, and also what does sustainability mean to them. And it was interesting that they still saw education as being quite didactic, and from their sustainability lens, they still seemed to be very focused around environmental, and it wasn't as deeply embedded as I hoped or thought that it would be after 3 years. So that was the beginning. So the aims for you and for children and for early childhood education is the idea of rethinking education. So, you know, we need to consider what is the purpose of education in early childhood. Is it seen as just a preparation or a foundation for being in the primary school, as that's what it says in the early years foundation stage? It's just getting them ready for when they go into the national curriculum. And even in the SDG 4, it still talks about it being as preparation for going into primary school or proper school. So a difficult question that could be asked is, how do we challenge this? How do we change government policy thinking and also parental thinking about what is the purpose of early childhood education. So how do we challenge that? It's still recognised by UNESCO that there is an urgent need for new approaches in early childhood and in education in particular. And therefore, you could question that this is obviously a time when we can challenge that idea of people just listening and children answering questions, and that this is the time where we actually need to sort of be thinking about how do we get children to be agents of change? How do we get rights of children to be clearly embedded into everything that they do? And so a question you ask the students, and I ask the students, is how do we achieve this? And therefore another question is how does your pedagogy reflect a critically reflective questioning philosophy when the early years foundation stage that so many practitioners, managers adhere to with rigor, it says that the children must listen and respond to what they hear with relevant questions. So if the children are just listening and responding, they're obviously not asking any questions, and therefore they can't be having any opportunities to be engaged in things that are provoking them. And we have, again, another difficult question of saying, is this what early childhood should be? Children just responding and answering what is appropriately deemed by the adult, which in some cases I've seen horrendous practice where the adult is doing the same activity every year in, year out. And therefore you could be questioning, what are these children learning? So how does a question again then is, how does your pedagogy make your children and students think and be able to be provoked? Therefore, they need to start being decision recipients. They must be the ones that are coming up with the solutions. They are the ones that need to be challenging what is happening. And we've obviously seen that with older children like Greta Thunberg, where they are questioning. But when do we allow early childhood children to have this opportunity to be decision recipients, where they make the decisions and it's not given to them? Even the UN Children's Rights is written by an adult, it's not written by children. And therefore, again, you are questioning, when do we give children the opportunities to actually be agents of change? Education has also got to be an opportunity to be ruffling and unsettling. So you have to sort of like question, have you got any unconscious biases that infiltrate your thinking, your pedagogy? And this was a very sort of relevant to me, because when I started the module, I never thought that I had any unconscious biases. And it was very important that in this safe environment with the students, that I was open and reflective and honest about my errors or my unconscious bias. And I reflected on the time when I used to live in Australia, and that society, education, my family all talked about the Australian First Nation people in a very derogatory way. The language was always, they are a waste of space, they are lazy, drunken layabouts. This was the language that I heard all of the time. And I never saw, and the sad thing is I never saw any people from the First Nations. This was what I had saturated into me all of the time. And so as a consequence of that, I started the module by talking about these biases and saying, how do we ever see both sides of the narrative if you have an unconscious bias and that you're not aware of what is.
Hello there. Just while Diane is taking a quick break, which she told us that would happen, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Diane and her background. She's got over 40 years of experience in education, teaching a range of age ranges from 3 up to 11 in early years and primary teaching. So her research and her reflections are really kind of coming from a plethora of different roles and responsibilities and experiences in HE, in primary and early years. And for the last 18 years, Diane has worked in supporting students who are going to work in early childhood or going to teach across disciplines across a variety of programs and modules. And she has a real strong underpinning for what she works with and talks about and supports students to inquire about in sustainability and challenging thinking, challenging how we look at climate and eco and practice-based thinking and dominant kind of discourses. So, and she's really interested in provoking as to how we can get quite comfortable in our thinking and be quite habitual. And so a lot of Diane's work challenges a dominant way of understanding and doing early years practice and immersing in it. So that's where we are. So I thought I'd bring that in now at this opportune moment where we knew that Diane would have a quick break. So this is the joy of online. And just while you are with us today, do think about any questions you have about your own unconscious bias, as Diane shared her thoughts, and we were talking before the seminar started about, are we ever conscious of our unconscious bias, and how the dominant environment and the discourse of where we are really influences our thinking and our language and our words. So these are the kind of reflections that Diane was really provoking with us pre-seminar today. So I think Diane's back now, so I'll be able to hand back over to her.
Sorry about that. So sort of like I need to go back to where I was. Oh, so what I want you to do is, this was one of the activities that I do with the students. So every single week there was provocation. And this particular session was, I used the fence as a provocation. And I asked them to think about what a fence would look or mean through a social, cultural, sustainable lens. And the majority of students were responding with things like, it's about a territorial thing, it's about making something safe, something that recognizes it's mine, or safety. And that was the initial thoughts. So then I sort of said, well, I actually want you to think of it from a different perspective, because there was no recognition of otherness. So I talked about it from an Australian perspective, because obviously I'd already shared my experiences of living in Australia. And it's sort of like recognizing that fences could actually mean a symbolic regulation of self and others. It's a power discourse. And that it was, to the Australians, the First Nations of Australia, it was about the fact that the picket fence went up as the white colonialists started to move into Australia. So as the white colonialists landed, the picket fences and the fences went up, and therefore they didn't represent to them safety or security. It was a recognition of loss, of trauma, of grief, of death. And it was quite interesting for the students to start looking at fences from a different perspective, because we are so used to having a fence from our perspective that when you start to look at it from something else's perspective. And I also talked about it with the students in terms of non-humans as well. When we put fences up, what does that mean to the wildlife? But obviously in this context of this talk, I'm just talking about it from the decolonizing aspect. And so it was seen as something that was very, very criminal to the Aboriginal Australians, how the fence was used to symbolize power, and it was to symbolize what was taken away from them. And it was also seen as a dangerous place of surveillance. So it's very important that we sort of start to look at it and think, well, what does a fence mean to you? And so obviously, when I would say to students, what does a fence mean to you? Do you think about this? And Australia was a long way away from them. So again, there was a recognition that, well, it doesn't really make any difference to us. We're not Australian. We're not First Nation people. I've never had that happen to me. So it didn't matter. And so it was really, really important that you then just start to think of things that were more closer to home. A lot of the students that we have at Liverpool come from Northern Ireland, the vast majority of them. And there was a lot of Northern Ireland students in my cohort. And interestingly, it turned out that the 3 years that they had been in as students, and friends, religion had never, ever come up in their friendships. So they had never said to each other when they became friends, are you Protestant? Are you Catholic? It never came up in their conversations. It was just, where are you from? And that was it. So because we'd had this conversation around Australia and that there was this understanding of, yeah, okay, I can see what you mean, but I then said, okay, let's look at it. Let's look at a fence through a Northern Ireland lens. And there is this school called Hazelwood Primary, and it's in Belfast, and it's right in the middle of Belfast. And when I went to visit it, I drove onto the estate, and I thought that the Queen was due that day. Every single lamppost had a Union Jack flying from it. Every single wall had a painting of the Queen. I then turned the next corner and the Irish tricolour was flying, and there was big murals of IRA heroes. And this school is an integrated primary. So it's right in the middle of a contested area of Belfast, but it is mixed, Protestant and Catholic. Majority of schools in Ireland are not. They are single denomination. Now, the children that you can see in this picture are standing by the side of what is known as the Peace Wall or the Peace Fence of Hazelwood. So these children go into this school, they cross through this peace fence. When they are inside the school, they are friends. They talk to each other and they don't have any considerations of whether they are Catholic, Protestant. But the moment they leave the building and they cross back through the fence, they are not allowed to communicate with each other, because that is what the families and the communities say, even though they are at an integrated primary school. When the children themselves were asked how they felt about these walls, this fence going up, no adults had actually consulted with the children about what they wanted. And not one of the children who were interviewed could actually see any purpose to why this peace fence, ironically called a peace fence, was still up. They understood why it might have gone up 30 years ago, but they couldn't see how it was being helpful to have a peace fence, because of the fact that it was not bringing people together. It was not being about a happy community. And so as a consequence of this, where I sort of suddenly started making the students think about something that was happening within their own country and that was very close to home, whereas Australia seemed a long way away, they started to sort of like think about it. And it was very interesting then that we had some conversations. For instance, I've just put two up, but Samantha had always said when she left Northern Ireland to come to Liverpool was never, ever setting foot back in Ireland again. She said, I have no wish to go back there. I have no wish to, because of the troubles. I don't want to be part of it. But as a result of this module, and this module obviously unpicks a lot more than what I'm able to talk about just in this conversation now, we started to really unpick what it means to be part of a community that is segregated, with bias and with violence and with troubles. And in the end, in her presentation, when her reflection, because they had to use their journals to then reflect in their presentation, she said, if I don't go back, who will? And if people like me don't ever stand up for what needs to be done in Northern Ireland, it will never happen. And so as a consequence of doing this module, when Samantha finished and graduated, she returned to Northern Ireland and is now teaching in Northern Ireland and is trying very hard to try and break that invisible fence that is there in the classroom all of the time in terms of Protestant and Catholic children. I've also put in Megan, who was a Welsh student, because another of the provocations that we had was about the Maori, and we had a Skype with a practitioner in New Zealand, and she too had said, after listening to the Maori conversation about their loss of language, she said she realised that she spoke Welsh, she never used Welsh, so she made a point from that point on, after the Maori provocation, to start texting her friends in Welsh. And she said, if I don't do something and help bring the Welsh language back, who will. And Megan now is speaking in Welsh, is teaching in a Welsh language school back in Wales. So the point of what I'm trying to say here is that sometimes having difficult dialogues with students and children may be unsettling to begin with, but there is always maybe a possible positive outcome. As a consequence of talking about Northern Ireland and the peace wall and the Troubles, it started to talk and unpick about colonialism. For instance, the students started to talk, and one student said, well, I've never seen any problems or any difficulties in Northern Ireland. I don't know what you're talking about. And I said to her, are you a Protestant? And she said, yes. And her friend immediately turned to her and said, well, that's why I'm Catholic and I have. And I said, because again, I reiterate this safe environment and this importance of having a good relationship with people, to ask them to talk about things that are extremely sensitive. I said, could you share your feelings? And she did. She gave an example of that she could be driving her car and she comes to a junction, and if she turns left, it is the quickest route to where she wants to go. But if she turns right, it's a longer route, but she said it's a safer route. And so when I said, what do you mean it's a safer route? She said, well, if I turn left, they will know I'm Catholic. And obviously the English students and the Protestant students were immediately like, what? And I sort of said, please explain what you mean. How can they tell you are Catholic if you're sitting in your car? And she said, they just can. And I don't go that way. I will avoid any situation where I think. And when you actually sort of like think this is still happening in Northern Ireland, and we may think that it's all sort of like completely stopped because of the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement and the Windsor Agreement. It's not. It's still happening. It is still very much a divided nation. At the moment, I'm in the middle of working with Stranmillis University on developing a Northern Ireland sustainable development resource. And in the consequence of it, we've talked about this, and they've said about how it's very difficult when you are trying to sort of like knock down these walls, these divisions, these invisible fences. If you've got the Catholic religion seems to be now becoming much more open to talking about health and well-being, morals, and using more of the New Testament, whereas the Protestant curriculum is tending to focus more on the Old Testament and staying very much rooted in the past. Now, that is just conversations I've had. That is nothing that is definite, but it underlines that difficulty if you have always got these divisions, these lines, these fences. How do you break them down? How do you sort of ruffle and disrupt something that will help to break down these problems? This was a picture that I just put out as a thought for provocation. You know, like, what does this represent to people when you look at this picture? To me, I think that it represents colonialism in a very, very visual manner, with the fact that all of the children that live on this Caribbean island are literally squashed behind a fence and have just got their hands through to touch the white savior that has come to visit them and ride around in a Land Rover. But this would just be the sort of provocation that I would put out there to students to say, what does this mean to you? And it can be also used with children. And we have to sort of start to try and move away from always thinking of children as being that we can't ask them questions. We can't unsettle them, because all of these conversations around Australia, Northern Ireland, the Caribbean, these are all narratives of colonialism. This idea that you can just take what is yours, and that by putting a fence around it, it now becomes yours. And, you know, we must resist the desiring silence, because it's so easy to just stay silent and not say anything. And that is the difficult dialogue. When do you have these difficult conversations? And I would also sort of like say, I can remember when Harry and Meghan were doing their videos for Netflix. I actually watched it out of interest. And I thought it was very interesting that Harry was talking about his unconscious bias when he was saying that if you walk along the corridors of Buckingham Palace, there are statues of children with chains that represent slaves, and how he feels now very uncomfortable with that sort of thing. So we have to resist this desiring silence and start to talk about things that continually protect white privilege. And we need to be advocates. The Early Childhood Studies benchmark standards notes that students must be advocates. And to be an advocate, you have to challenge, and you have to be able to sort of disrupt legacies of trauma that others are still having to deal with as a result of that. So from a disruptive point of view, we just need to carry on sort of like challenging the colonialism with its developmentalist framings, with exclusive human-centered theories shaped by colonialist interventions. I briefly mentioned that another aspect that we did in this module was about the non-human world, and that some of the students who scored absolutely fantastically high marks, because I was really struggling to find something that was wrong with it. One student did a presentation about a spider in her home and how she had changed as a result of thinking about these disruptions of developmentalist framings through an exclusive human-centered lens. And another student who did a wonderful essay about a dead caterpillar in her garden as a result of her negligence. And it is about disrupting these ideas of marginalizing others and always having one way of being. And that's one thing that I've learned through working now with the First Nation people in Australia, is that the Indigenous ways of being is so much more aligned with a rights perspective. It's about all having a rights. Everybody, it's believing with the wisdoms of people who have lived for thousands of years before, and that everybody has a place, and that everybody is listened to and respected. And therefore we need to try and bring ourselves more into line with this type of thinking. We need to be unsettled, and we need to unsettle in early childhood. We need to question these truths that we hold up, and we have to unmask them. Question: how do you break down invisible fences in early years? How do you unsettle when the research shows that fundamental values and attitudes are formed in early childhood? This was an example that Glenda McNaughton did in Australia, and I used it when we were talking about Australia. And Glenda McNaughton, when she was doing her research with the preschoolers in Australia, that identified that children as young as 3 and 4 were able to clearly articulate to them what an Australian was. And this is around, again, the context of Australia Day, as January the 26th, where even I would celebrate Australia Day. But what does that Australia Day mean? It means it's a day when the white Australians took a land that was not theirs. And in this research, the children described Australians as being blonde, blue-eyed and white. And there was no concept of any understanding of a non-white. They were seen, as it says there, as being scary black faces or Red Indians, or they came from Aboriginal land, but they weren't connected to Australia. Now, if these children are forming these values at the age of 3 and 4, and we don't do any unsettling in early childhood, and we leave it until they are older, when adults think that they can deal with these sensitive issues, these attitudes will be deeply ingrained, and we have to stop these being deeply ingrained. We have to challenge them and say, sorry, this is not happening. And in Northern Ireland, with the troubled past of Northern Ireland, with the Belfast Agreement and then the Windsor Agreement, it's all impacting on communities. And whilst everybody wants to have peace, we have to recognise that, again, Walsh 2016 highlights by the age of 6 years old that children have already developed sectarian and racist views. Therefore, again, if you put the two together, McNaughton and Walsh, when are we going to disrupt this to the point where we are saying enough is enough? And I've just thrown in the refugees. This is something that Naomi, who was my tutor colleague that I was doing the module with, we didn't actually ever talk about Ukraine. We never got round to it. It didn't run this year, and if it had run this year, then it would have come up. But Ukrainian refugees, or refugees in general, are really in the same position of the Catholic Northern Ireland situation, or the First Nations in Australia. Another group of people we looked at with fences was the American-Mexican border. But, you know, when do we recognize the importance of disruption and unsettledness? And when we ask, say, when are refugees or people who we have disrupted going to be awarded the same political, social rights as everybody? Again, it's that resisting of that white supremacist, resisting of those regimes of truth. Have Ukrainian children or refugees in general, and we tend to forget about the Sudan and Syria and Afghanistan, have these children become so deterritorialized that we don't see them as being important anymore? Why are they unwelcome? And at the moment, this is happening in my locality, where there is a hotel that is about 10 minutes from me, where there are refugees that are being housed, and the local people don't want them there. And we have to question this. And this is something that should be being talked about in the schools and the early childhood settings around these hotels with refugees, to ask them, how would you feel if you had to flee in the middle of the night with a suitcase and you didn't know where you were going to end up? Recognizing that early childhood students are advocates for young children's needs, voice, rights, development and learning. How do we promote inclusion and diversity if we don't disrupt, if we don't unsettle, and we don't try to fight and stand up for the marginalized? So what is my question again would be, as advocates of early childhood studies, what is our role here? What is our role in terms of disrupting, to unsettle, to contest the marginalized? The Global Monitoring Report in 2019 was highlighting, again, building on the 2016 report, which was about embedding transformative education and having new approaches to education. To me, a new approach to education is to move away from a learning outcome, assessment-driven early childhood, but to be more around a well-designed curriculum that provokes critical skills and challenges children to be thinkers. Because without them being able to think, they'll never have solutions to problems that we have ahead in terms of supporting sustainability. And I have added here, in terms of a resource that we have developed as part of the sustainable strategy for early childhood, we developed this resource as part of the sustainable strategy group for the Early Childhood Studies degree network, and this is an English version, and it won the OMEP World Prize last year in Athens. And as a result, I have been working with Northern Ireland and Australia, and the Northern Ireland one will be due to completed this week, and the Australian one is very near completion. And so hopefully those two areas of provocation and unsettling and disruption, hopefully there will be opportunities for early years practitioners to start to use the Sustainable Development Goals to unsettle, to start to get children to be aware of the differences, the otherness of the world that they live in, rather than it always being centered around what the adults think children need to know or should know. And I've just mentioned that. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, if you're Catholic or Protestant, various schools are integrated. So how do you fight the old ways of thinking if you never have an opportunity? So hopefully the resource will help practitioners and students and children to start having unsettling discussions around living in Northern Ireland. And as you can see, this is just some images from it. It's the Northern Ireland and the Australian one is both relevant and contextual to each country through their history, culture, and geography. They are very, very similar because they are both colonies. And that is the emphasis that really needs to be centered here, is that a lot of the problems that are happening in the world are a result of colonialism, where we built our fences and just took what we wanted. So both of these resources, the Australian one is around reconciliation with the First Nation people, and Northern Ireland is about trying to recognise that Northern Ireland was actually only sort of developed in 1921, and it was part of Ireland, and we have to have those conversations about what that means for people living in these countries, and it being contextual. The conversations must be contextual to your community and to your place. Thank you for listening. And I have no idea if I've talked very quickly or too fast.
Oh, Diane, thank you absolutely so much. That was a wonderful, provocative presentation, bang on time, bang on the button. So much for us to respond to, but I know that Professor Jane Osgood might have to leave, and she's contributed to the chat. So can I hand over to Jane just so that she can join us before she has to leave? That's okay, Jane.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So I have no voice and I have to leave in about 2 minutes, but I've put a ton of stuff in the chat. It's a really wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
What was striking me was how it resonated with lots of work that's already in existence. And so I've mentioned a few of them in there: the reconceptualizing early childhood education, community, social justice in early childhood, but particularly, I'm sure you're familiar with them, but the Common Worlds Collective.
Yes, absolutely love them.
Yeah, so they were the things that were kind of triggered for me, that it's actually really heartening that you've struck a chord on what is so important and needs to be done. And thankfully, there is a long history and it is being done. But I agree, the more that we can embed this within our pedagogy at every level, from what happens firsthand, in relations with very young children and families, and then through our training programs and our teacher training programs, and all layers of education, then and I think the point that you raised that was really powerful and important is that children can teach us. It's just how we position them, and it goes back to the whole debate about the image of the child. What is our image of the child? And using that as our starting place, we can learn with and from children, rather than imposing an adult-centric and quite often wrong worldview on their lives. So I'm sorry, now I have to leave, but
no, thank you for your
huge thank you.
Very kind comments. I love the Commonwealth framework. I have read all of those books and those papers, and I would love more than anything for either Africa Taylor or Veronica to come over and to just listen to them, because they resonate with everything, because they're looking at it from a Canadian perspective. And I love the British Columbian early years framework. That is so fabulous as well, that we used in that module as well, as an example of good practice. So yeah, thank you for those. Very kind that's really kind. Thank you, Jane.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I'm afraid I have to leave now.
No,
but
thank you.
Thanks again. That was really, really great.
Thank you, Jane. Again, just following on from Jane's point to you, Diane, I don't know if you had a response that you wanted to kind of add on to more, but I just thought that point that you said really early on in your session about the decision recipients. I think, you know, being a recipient, and you put the word decision in front of it. I thought that was really powerful. Do you want to explore that a bit further?
Well, it's interesting. Before I came on here, I was just writing up a presentation that I'm going to be doing when I do the Australian launch in December in Sydney. And I've been doing this work with Naomi and Ian Jones, who is the head of this school in Wales. It's an absolutely fabulous school, and it has got sustainability embedded throughout, and every single class has an enterprise business. And I have interviewed each of the classes, and the children from nursery upwards, right up to year 6, as I said, have their own business. And nursery children obviously have no understanding of the idea of money as a transaction in terms of the economy, but they were all aware of the fact that the thing they were making, then somebody could have it. So they were already aware that there was a process there around a product. But by the time the reception, they were able to talk about profits and loss, and that they knew that there was £1.50 per seed bag, and that they were selling it. And as a result of that, the money that they made came back into their class, and that they, as a group, could choose what they want to do with it. And I was researching before I came on about social consumerism. And up to now, everything I've read has said that either parents don't think children should be doing anything about money. And what was it, the words they'd written? They'd actually said money skills are not mentioned because they're not key. And that it says children of this age, between 4 and 6, must not be worried or concerned about this, i.e. money, because it's substantially regarded as a grown-up matter. And so this is just about money, but, you know, in the context of what I was doing in this session was about sort of your social, cultural community and the people you live with. But we, again, constantly with those Northern Ireland children around the Peace Wall, they're not asked whether they want the wall down or not. They are they're not given the decision to make. It's made for them. And it's, you know, like, when do we start to think that children are able to understand? And if they don't understand, what do we need to do to help them support them understanding, instead of it being, oh, they're just too young? Yeah,
absolutely. And you know that point that you said about that children, you know, they're not asked. It's the same as when then the data that you use, you said that, you know, I can tell if somebody's from North, you know, is a Protestant or a Catholic, or they can tell if I am. So if we don't ask children, how do they know that? Where have they picked that up? That you know, learning through osmosis and habitual kind of language and discussion from the adults, and the children, how they literally engage with that.
Yeah.
That just touches and really triangulates those points a lot that you're bringing up about exploring.
Because, you know, we mentioned the United Nations Rights of the Child, but it was written by adults for children. And again, like Julie Davis, when she really got all of this debate going in early childhood, when she talked about environmental sustainability, and she sort of said, you know, children are in the environment, they are with the environment, but they're not for the environment. And it's very much about sort of like, how do we encourage children, but most importantly, how do we encourage adults, whether it's parents or teachers, to recognize that children have got the agency? You know, the UNESCO Global Monitoring Report in 2016 advocated new approaches. Maria Montessori, in her 1947 lecture, said there needs to be new approaches where children are involved, but nobody's listening, or adults with power are not listening. And that's what it comes down to in the end, isn't it?
I think absolutely. And I think it's funny when you look at the UNCRC on that point you just said, and I will go over to the audience next, but see who wants to get ready for your questions. But the UNCRC, as you said, it's been written by adults for children. But, you know, thinking on that further, then who are these adults protecting these children from? Oh, is it the adults?
Yeah.
So, and again, who is this fence for? And why is it there?
It's another fence that children have to climb. And that's why I sort of said the question was, how do we break down these invisible fences? Because even though there is an article for children's rights, there will be some fences around it. It won't be, you know, you know, and as I said, just reading this, which is was in 2019, and this was about adults not wanting children to have an understanding about how money and debt. Well, you know, the early years students that I have no idea about how to use money or debt. They just don't know. We had to give sort of in Freshers Week, you have to give them sessions on how to budget. These children were actually, you know, the language they were using from 3 until 11, they were talking about having a responsibility. That was the language they said. If we don't learn about money, we won't be responsible for ourselves and others. And you think, well, why are adults so quick to say that children aren't mature enough to make decisions when they clearly are?
Yeah, and yet they're competent to know if somebody's from a particular religious group or not.
Yeah.
And no adult can hear or see that or understand the levels of a child, you know, their comprehension of the complexities of knowing if somebody looks like a Catholic or a Protestant, you know, these they really
I mean, like, I still really find it hard to equate that when that student talked about coming to that junction and that she turned right and not left because they, and it's that word they, and that's obviously the Protestants, you know, and this student who was her friend was a Protestant, and she was like, I can't believe you'd say that. What do you mean? And it then had a very uncomfortable dialogue about Protestant and Catholics' perceptions of Northern Ireland and about what it meant to both sides. And the English students that were sitting there listening were actually enthralled, because it was like, is this really happening? Is this what really goes on in Northern Ireland? Because we don't know. And if we don't know, then is it not being discussed in Northern Ireland either? No, because there's no authority there. Stormont's not sitting. So there isn't any direction. So it will come down to individual practitioners having that nerve to unsettle.
Yeah, and I think as well, the power of the fence, going back to your title, the fence, you know, the fence is there representing things that happened years and years ago. But actually, whilst the fence is protecting and safeguarding and dividing, it's also continuing whilst actually people aren't so involved as it was. So it's, really,
which is
really...
which is what the children, when they were interviewed at Hazelwood, said. I don't know why this is here. We don't want it here. Nobody's asking us. We don't want it here, but it's there, and it's called a peace wall. And you just think, how is that a peace wall?
Is anybody like to jump in here before we come to an end of the conference? I know there's a few more that might want to come in with any comments to anything that's kind of been provoked with you with Diane today. I'll go to Verma first, and then I'll come back to everybody else. Thank you, Verma.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, firstly, Diane, for a lovely presentation.
Oh, thank
you. It was
you.
so insightful. It really did resonate with me deeply. And it triggered a few of my own biases and my own filters. And I was fully aware of that. My question is, could you kind of unpick and unravel you stated the unconscious bias on your own. You shared a bit of your own unconscious bias and practitioners' unconscious bias. And are we conscious of our own unconscious bias? I do really, really kind of appreciate this presentation, in the sense that the seeds that you're planting, the dangerous ideas, if you will like to call them, and these conversations are so, so important to have, because it's opening up our criticality. It's enabling these, dangerous conversations to happen, to bring them forward that they do exist.
I think it's also interesting that you're calling them dangerous conversations. It's like a dangerous conversation to who? And it's, again, that idea of sort of like the desiring silence and about that white privilege, because the dangerous conversation is so that the desiring silence just stays as silent. Nobody talks about it. And I think that because of the fact that the research that I'm doing with Naomi, are you there, Naomi? Is Naomi here?
No, she hasn't joined us yet. No.
The research that I'm doing with Naomi at this school in Wales is about the fact that, all of the time we say about fundamental values are developed in early years. And I really wanted to find out whether that was true, because this head had been there for 28 years. and he has embedded all three pillars of sustainability. And I wanted to know whether it really had a longevity. And the evidence is showing that it does, that, you know, the alumni of the adult alumni are responding with questionnaires to show it does. And therefore, I think, well, if this is demonstrating that a positive role model, a positive ethos, it can have such a magnificent sort of correlation with positive values, then it's really important that we do this in early childhood and we have those dangerous conversations in a sensitive way, because it depends on the society and the community that your setting is in. So it might have Polish refugees, or it might be an area where there has been, like when it was in Liverpool, the Toxteth riots. So things like, there might be situations that are inflammatory or could be seen, but you have to have those conversations, because otherwise you only hear one side of the story. And it's really important for you to be able to have an unbiased view of your world, i.e. the children, that they hear both sides and that they can ask those questions. But the trouble is that parents in early childhood have a very big role and also have a tendency to try to squash that. And so it needs to be, again, put out very much sort of into policy as well. And in my role as sustainability lead with our group, we have written to Helen Hayes, who's the Labour shadow education. I just got an email back, Angela, saying that she's very busy and she's taken it into consideration. But we were saying you have to have these conversations, and it needs to be in education. But, you know, all we can do is work from the grassroots up and try and break some of these fences down. I don't know if I answered your question, Vermeer, or not.
Yes, I agree. I absolutely agree. I don't know if you know about Foucault's the dark biopolitics of self-surveillance.
Yes, I think
So
an Australian colleague.
Programming. So we are now kind of conditioned in a way to self-surveillance, correct our language, our body language, our mannerism. And I think children from very, very young, from early childhood, we're kind of conditioned and programmed, if you like, to self-surveillance, self-correct, to kind of watch our own language, our own bodies, our own thought processes, and kind of, you know, snap back in what is acceptable and what's, you know, deemed as socially accepted, and what we should be doing in classrooms and how we should be thinking. So I think that it's more of a case as, bottom up, grassroots, but really unpicking and unraveling our own kind of programming, our own infrastructures.
And I think that's why I started with that, with the fact that you have to recognize who you are. And because if you have got an unconscious bias, you will only be telling one side of the story. And you've got to be able to say, this is the two sides. And, you know, and again, using the idea of the fence, you've got to be able to see both sides of the fence. And therefore, if you don't, you're only ever seeing just one lens, and children need to see both to become informed participants of the world. You know, we can't transform education if we're not allowing children to have all of the facts. And obviously, they're not having all of the facts if they're only responding appropriately, i.e. the language of the early years foundation stage. You know, what is an appropriate response? So
thank you, Verma, for opening up.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, and just on your point, Verma, and Diane's response, you know, what is actually dangerous? Is it dangerous talking about these things? Why? Where have we learned these boundaries from? And why are we like sheep, you know, next to fences that aren't electrocuted, but yet are they? Because why do we think that talking about religion or culture or bias or about what's unspoken, you know, is dangerous? And is it because of our understanding of what ethics are, the moral and the, you know, ethical side of it, and then does it mooch over to the legal side of it? You know, if we're looking at the UNCRC, for instance, and the safety for who? Is it safety for children not to talk about these things, or is it safe for us adults for many reasons? You know, that we want to keep this professional boundary, and we don't want to open up a Pandora's box that we can't contain. You know, there's all these real.
I mean, it would be really interesting with that resource that we've got, Angela, that the resource has got lots of different ideas for provocations in the early childhood setting, and it could be from an image, and it could be that one of Kate shaking hands through the wall. What does that mean to children? If they saw that, what does that mean? If you were if you were a child looking at that, what would you think it means? But sort of like the whole idea is that you're opening up for children to start having a dialogue, and they may be difficult dialogues, but the idea of the resource that we've developed, it's not around learning outcomes, it's not around expectations, it's about following where the children take you. And it might be that you read a story in one setting, and then down the road you read the same story and they take you on two different paths. And it's about going where the children take you. It's very much about following them and leading you through the gate, through the fence.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree.
Going beyond the gate. Sorry, going
beyond the gate.
And the fence, absolutely. Well, Diane, I have to say this has been really a wonderful session, so provocative, and it really does pick up those difficult dialogue strands and the complexities of working with children, working with other professionals in an interdisciplinary circumstance, but actually being professionals who are advocates, who are pushing boundaries and removing fences and the challenges of it. And I think your session has just been absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. I was so nervous about it beforehand, hoping that I was doing what you needed me to say. So it's nice to hear that if I have hit the nail on the head.
Absolutely.
You've done more than that for me.
Thank you for that.
And I think you've also crossed over to Dr. Abel Longo when he's leading on the eco-pedagogies. You know, what you've talked about here really crosses, as Jane said earlier, it crosses over between, you know.
Yeah, I mean, the student who wrote the essay about the caterpillar, and it's about that idea that you don't think about anybody else, you just think about your place, it's your space. And after we had done this module, she wrote an absolutely amazing essay on the fact that she had reflected on the fact that the garden, her garden, who she saw as her garden, is actually a garden that's the home to so many other things as well, and that they have a right. And that she reflected on the fact that she'd left a cane outside with a piece of string attached to it, and a caterpillar had got entangled in it and died. And the whole of her essay was round the reflection on the death of the caterpillar, and that she had never considered before looking at the garden through the lens of non-human world, and about the fact that it wasn't just her space, it was it's really important. And that's why I sort of mentioned the otherness aspect, that it's not just otherness from a Catholic Protestant colonial taking of land aspect. It's about the fact that, you know, in the SDG resource, we've got pictures of building sites where you say, what's happened to all of the animals and the habitats, and, you know, who makes the decision? It's usually about money and power again that make the decision about whether you're going to completely erase a hedgerow and a beautiful forest just so we can build some houses so that humans can live somewhere near a green place.
Yeah, and put some more fences up.
Put some more fences up saying, this is mine.
Well, I'm going to thank you, Diane. And just before we do call it the end of our session, bang on time, I have to say, our next session with eco-pedagogies, which is the strand that we, Abel leads on, is going to be on Monday the 5th of June. Again, it's another lunchtime online seminar, and Abel will be, or maybe Abel, do you want to introduce it? You're here, so better to hear it from you.
No, I mean, just to say that we'll be on artificial intelligence. So yeah, aesthetic experiences with artificial intelligence in primary teaching. It's based on international project that we are working on, which is very much related to eco-pedagogy. Yeah.
Lovely. Well, we look forward to joining you for that, Abel. And Diane, massive thank you. And thank you.
Many thanks.
Thank you for asking me.
Thank you.